King Henry VIII ordered the royal treasurer to issue tens of thousands of pounds to build a private retinue for his illegitimate son, Henry FitzRoy. The boy was granted the title of Duke of Richmond, directly outranking hundreds of long-standing nobles in England. This child, born to a lady-in-waiting, suddenly possessed his own army and controlled tens of thousands of acres of fertile land. Pouring money and handing over power proved that Henry VIII considered this illegitimate child an important political asset instead of a family stain. He was educated in military skills and state administration exactly like a future king to solve the thirst for a male heir. This massive physical investment only ended when FitzRoy contracted a lung disease and died, completely destroying the most expensive backup plan of the Tudor dynasty. The Tudor dynasty relied on a clear male succession to prevent the return of civil war. However, King Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon resulted in a series of reproductive failures. Following multiple stillbirths and infant deaths, their only surviving child was a daughter, Princess Mary. This succession crisis created severe political instability and left the king questioning if he was physically capable of producing a male heir. Amid this growing pressure, Henry began a relationship with Elizabeth Bessie Blount, an attendant in Queen Catherine's household. The affair unfolded quietly within the daily routines of the court, heavily shaped by the immense power imbalance between a monarch and a servant. Bessie managed the situation with strict discretion, securing royal appointments for her father without provoking a public scandal. The relationship remained successfully contained until 1518. That year, Bessie became pregnant and gave birth to a son, Henry FitzRoy. Although born outside of marriage and legally barred from the throne, he was the only illegitimate child the king ever officially acknowledged. Henry VIII immediately elevated the boy, granting him royal titles, vast lands, and a household staff reserved for princes. FitzRoy's arrival fundamentally changed court politics because it finally proved the king could father a healthy son. An unexpected royal pregnancy caused immediate problems. Catherine of Aragon was both Queen of England and a Spanish princess with strong foreign ties. Disrespecting her openly would damage international relations. Furthermore, a pregnancy involving the king was a major political event. It was not just standard court gossip. If the baby survived, its gender would be extremely important. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey was brought into the arrangements. Bessie was removed from the center of court and sent to the Augustinian Priory of St. Lawrence at Blackmore in Essex. The location offered privacy and security. Royal funds supported her care and provisions. Among courtiers, the retreat became known as Jericho. There, in June 1519, Bessie gave birth to a healthy boy. For Henry VIII, the importance of the birth was immediate. This was not another pregnancy that ended in miscarriage. It was not another stillborn prince. It was a living male child carrying Henry's blood. Whatever doubts the king may have had about his ability to father sons, this child appeared to answer them. Henry did not attempt to erase the boy from public knowledge. Instead, he acknowledged him. Cardinal Wolsey served as godfather at the child's christening. The involvement of one of the most powerful churchmen and ministers in England gave the ceremony considerable political weight. Most importantly, Henry gave the boy a name that publicly identified his paternity, Henry FitzRoy. FitzRoy meant son of the king. The name removed any serious ambiguity over the child's father. Henry VIII was telling the political world that this boy was his son, even though he had been born outside marriage. The existence of FitzRoy also changed the way Henry could interpret Catherine of Aragon's reproductive history. The king now had evidence, at least in his own mind, that he could produce a healthy male child. The problem was therefore not necessarily his own physical inability. Bessie Blount had given him what years of marriage to Catherine had failed to provide, a living son. This conclusion would become increasingly important as Henry began searching for a solution to his legitimate succession problem. FitzRoy, however, could not remain simply the son of a former royal mistress. If Henry intended to use him politically, the boy had to be detached from the circumstances of his birth and raised within a controlled royal environment. Bessie therefore did not raise him. By 1522, she had married Gilbert Talboys, a wealthy ward of the crown. Estates in Lincolnshire were secured for the couple, and Bessie went on to have legitimate children within her marriage. Her life increasingly moved away from the central royal court. FitzRoy, meanwhile, entered a very different world. The boy was given an independent household. This was not merely a group of attendants assigned to care for a royal child. FitzRoy's establishment resembled a small court. More than 200 servants, guards, administrators, and other personnel served around him. They wore his own blue and yellow livery, giving the household a visible identity separate from other aristocratic establishments. Thomas Magnus, an experienced diplomat and royal servant, supervised the household's organization and finances. The scale of the arrangement showed how seriously Henry VIII regarded the boy's upbringing. FitzRoy was not being raised as an obscure, illegitimate relative who might later receive a modest estate. He was being educated in a manner appropriate for someone expected to exercise authority. His academic education was extensive. John Palsgrave, a prominent linguist, taught him French and courtly skills. French was especially important because diplomacy between England and continental Europe required fluency in the language and an understanding of the culture surrounding the French court. Richard Croke, an accomplished classical scholar associated with Cambridge, instructed FitzRoy in Latin and Greek. The curriculum also included subjects such as theology, classical philosophy, and Roman law. These were not simply academic decorations. A Renaissance prince was expected to understand government, religion, diplomacy, history, and the intellectual traditions used to justify political authority. Reports from his education suggest that FitzRoy was a capable student. He had a strong memory and apparently showed an aptitude for languages. There is no indication that Henry considered him intellectually inadequate. On the contrary, the resources invested in his education continued to increase. But Henry VIII did not want to raise a scholar alone. The Tudor political ideal of a male ruler included physical strength, military competence, horsemanship, hunting, and skill with weapons. FitzRoy's household, therefore, spent heavily on armor, horses, swords, bows, and other equipment associated with aristocratic martial training. The boy developed a particular interest in hunting and archery. During a journey when he was still very young, he reportedly killed a stag at Collyweston. For Henry VIII, who strongly valued hunting and displays of masculine physical ability, such achievements reinforced the image of FitzRoy as a promising royal son. By the middle of the 1520s, the contrast between FitzRoy and Princess Mary was becoming increasingly politically significant. Mary remained Henry VIII's legitimate child. Her mother was Queen Catherine, and her legitimacy was recognized throughout Catholic Europe. FitzRoy possessed none of those legal advantages, but FitzRoy was male. That single distinction became more important as Catherine grew older and the possibility of another pregnancy disappeared. By 1525, Henry could no longer realistically expect his marriage to Catherine to produce a new son. The king now faced a difficult question. He had a legitimate daughter and an illegitimate son. Neither provided the straightforward succession he wanted. His response was not to leave FitzRoy in the background. On June 7, 1525, the 6-year-old boy was taken to St. George's Chapel at Windsor and inducted into the Order of the Garter, the highest and most prestigious order of chivalry in England. 11 days later, Henry went much further. At Bridewell Palace, in front of leading members of the English aristocracy and foreign observers, FitzRoy was formally raised into the peerage. He became Earl of Nottingham and then received two far more significant titles, Duke of Richmond and Duke of Somerset. The choices were highly deliberate. Richmond had been associated with Henry VII before he became king. Henry VII had been Earl of Richmond before defeating Richard III and founding the Tudor monarchy. Somerset was closely connected with the Beaufort family, the line through which the Tudors traced an important part of their royal ancestry. By giving FitzRoy both names, Henry VIII wrapped his illegitimate son in the dynastic history of the Tudor family. The elevation also transformed FitzRoy's practical position within English politics. He was no longer merely the acknowledged natural son of the king. He was now one of the highest-ranking nobles in England, carrying titles directly associated with the rise of the Tudor dynasty. Henry reinforced that position with money and office. Large estates were assigned to FitzRoy, producing an annual income estimated at almost £4,845. This placed him among the wealthiest people in the kingdom, despite his young age. He was also appointed to major positions including Lord High Admiral of England, Warden General of the Marches towards Scotland, and Lord President of the Council of the North. A 6-year-old could obviously not personally perform the daily administrative responsibilities attached to such offices. Experienced officials acted around him. But that was not the central point. Henry VIII was creating a political identity for his son. FitzRoy now had wealth, titles, a household, an education, administrative offices, and a public connection to the Tudor dynasty. Nothing yet made him heir to the throne. His illegitimacy remained a serious legal barrier. Nevertheless, by 1525, Henry VIII had already done something extraordinary. The child born discreetly at a priory in Essex had been transformed into the highest-ranking young nobleman in England, and Henry VIII had only begun to decide what role his son might eventually play. The titles granted to Henry FitzRoy in 1525 were not simply ceremonial rewards. Henry VIII was beginning to construct an alternative political future around his son. The king could not yet openly declare FitzRoy heir to the throne without provoking major legal and diplomatic problems, but he could surround the boy with almost every institution associated with princely authority. Wealth, military offices, regional government, education, and dynastic symbolism were all placed around FitzRoy, while the question of the succession remained officially unresolved. The most important part of this strategy was FitzRoy's connection with Northern England. Henry VIII appointed him Lord President of the Council of the North and Warden General of the Marches towards Scotland. These were positions connected with some of the most difficult regions of the kingdom. Northern England was geographically distant from London, politically conservative, and dominated by powerful aristocratic families with their own networks of retainers and military influence. Beyond the northern border stood Scotland, England's traditional enemy and a constant strategic concern. FitzRoy was therefore sent north rather than kept permanently at his father's court. His household operated from important centers such as Sheriff Hutton and Pontefract Castle. He was still a child, so experienced counselors handled the actual administration, but his physical presence mattered. Royal government in the 16th century depended heavily on visible authority. A council governing in the name of an absent monarch was useful, but a council centered around the king's own son carried greater political weight. In practical terms, FitzRoy became a symbol of direct Tudor authority in the north. The great northern families could see that Henry VIII was not leaving the region entirely in the hands of local magnates. The king had placed someone with royal blood at the center of the administration. Even though FitzRoy could not personally lead armies or manage complex legal disputes at 6 or 7 years old, his household represented the monarchy itself. This arrangement also gave Henry an opportunity to test how the political establishment would react to his illegitimate son holding major authority. The answer was important because FitzRoy's future remained uncertain. If the nobility had strongly rejected his elevation, Henry would have learned that using him in the succession could create serious instability. Instead, FitzRoy became increasingly integrated into the political hierarchy. His position was unusual, but not impossible to understand within Tudor society. Illegitimate children of kings were not unknown in European politics. They could receive land, titles, military commands, and important marriages. What made FitzRoy different was the scale of his advancement and the specific circumstances surrounding him. Henry VIII had no legitimate son. Every additional honor given to FitzRoy therefore carried an implication that would not have existed if a healthy Prince of Wales had been standing beside him. Foreign diplomats understood this immediately. The European courts followed Henry VIII's family problems closely because the English succession was an international issue. Princess Mary was not simply the daughter of Henry VIII. Through her mother, Catherine of Aragon, she was connected to the powerful Habsburg dynasty. Catherine's nephew was Emperor Charles V, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire and King of Spain. Any attempt to remove Mary from the succession therefore had consequences far beyond England. FitzRoy presented a difficult political choice for the Tudor dynasty. He was male, which was traditionally expected for a king, but he was not a lawful heir. This contrasted sharply with Mary, who was a lawful heir but was female. The core conflict was a choice between Mary's legal right to the throne and FitzRoy's traditional gender advantage. Henry VIII did not yet have a clean solution to this problem. Around the same period, his marriage to Catherine was moving toward open crisis. Henry increasingly wanted the marriage annulled so that he could marry again and attempt to produce a legitimate son. What later became the English Reformation initially developed from this dynastic problem. Henry wanted the church to declare that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid because she had previously been married to his brother Arthur. The papacy faced an extremely difficult situation. Catherine insisted that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated and that her marriage to Henry was therefore valid. Charles V strongly supported his aunt. Pope Clement VII could not simply give Henry everything he demanded without risking a confrontation with the most powerful ruler in Europe. During the negotiations, FitzRoy's existence became part of the search for alternatives. In 1528, Cardinal Lorenzo Campeggio, the papal legate sent to deal with Henry's marriage problem, became associated with an extraordinary proposal. One possible way to preserve Henry's marriage to Catherine while addressing the succession was to unite Princess Mary and Henry FitzRoy. They were half-siblings. Under ordinary circumstances, such a marriage would have been completely prohibited. But papal authority could issue dispensations in cases involving prohibited degrees of kinship, and the political crisis was serious enough that even an arrangement of this kind could be discussed. The idea was that Mary's legitimacy could be combined with FitzRoy's male Tudor blood, creating a dynastic union that might resolve the succession without destroying Henry's marriage to Catherine. The plan never happened, but its importance lies in the fact that it could be considered at all. FitzRoy was no longer treated merely as an acknowledged royal bastard who would receive money and estates. He had become important enough that senior churchmen and diplomats could imagine restructuring the Tudor succession around him. Henry ultimately rejected this route. He continued pursuing the annulment of his marriage and a new, legitimate marriage instead. Nevertheless, FitzRoy remained available as an alternative if the king's plans failed. By 1529, Henry began considering another remarkable possibility. FitzRoy was appointed Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. Ireland occupied an unusual position within Henry's dominions. English authority existed there, but large areas remained outside effective direct control. Powerful Anglo-Irish families and Gaelic lords maintained significant local autonomy. The crown constantly struggled to impose stable government. Within the royal government, discussions developed around the possibility of making FitzRoy King of Ireland. The proposal had a certain political logic. It would give Henry's son royal status while avoiding the immediate problem of naming him King of England or official heir to the English throne. FitzRoy could become a king in his own right without directly displacing Princess Mary. But the idea also carried serious dangers. Creating a separate Tudor monarchy in Ireland might ultimately weaken rather than strengthen Henry VIII's control. Once FitzRoy possessed his own royal title, household, territories, supporters, and military establishment, his interests might diverge from those of the English crown. Even if FitzRoy himself remained loyal to his father, later political factions could use him against London. Henry's advisors warned that Ireland could become an independent center of Tudor power. Instead of solving a problem, Henry might create a rival kingdom governed by his own son. In a succession crisis, factions hostile to the English monarch could rally around FitzRoy. Ireland could become a military base for intervention in England. The plan was abandoned. Even so, the fact that Henry seriously considered giving FitzRoy a crown demonstrated how far the boy had risen. Before reaching adolescence, FitzRoy had already been discussed as a potential king, even if not yet King of England. Meanwhile, Henry's conflict with Catherine continued to intensify. The inability to obtain the annulment he wanted pushed the king toward increasingly radical measures. Anne Boleyn had become central to his plans for a second marriage, and Henry was gradually moving toward rejecting papal authority over his marital case. For FitzRoy, these events created uncertainty. If Henry married Anne and she produced a healthy son, FitzRoy's importance would decline immediately. A legitimate Prince of Wales would outrank him regardless of his titles, offices, wealth, or personal abilities. FitzRoy could remain a powerful duke, but he would no longer stand near the center of the succession. If Anne failed to produce a son, however, FitzRoy would remain extremely valuable. Henry therefore continued preparing him for high political office rather than allowing his education to stagnate. The next stage of that preparation took FitzRoy beyond England. In October 1532, Henry VIII traveled to Calais for an important meeting with Francis I of France. The English king was attempting to strengthen his relationship with France during the increasingly dangerous political confrontation surrounding his marriage and the papacy. FitzRoy accompanied his father. This was significant because continental diplomacy was becoming an essential part of his education. The young duke had learned French from tutors, but living inside a foreign royal court was a different experience. It allowed him to observe how another monarchy functioned and to establish relationships with people who might eventually rule major European states. After Henry VIII returned to England, FitzRoy remained in France for almost a year. He lived among the French royal family and spent time with the sons of Francis I, including the Dauphin and the Prince, who would later become Henry II of France. He moved with the French court, shared aspects of their education, and experienced the culture of one of Europe's most sophisticated royal households. This period mattered because FitzRoy was now being treated socially as something close to a prince. European aristocratic culture was extremely conscious of rank. The circles into which he was admitted were not ordinary noble environments. He was living beside the sons of a king. The experience strengthened his French, but language was only one part of the education. He observed diplomacy, ceremony, aristocratic patronage, court competition, and the personal relationships through which 16th century politics operated. The French court was also larger and in many ways more elaborate than the English court, giving FitzRoy exposure to a different model of monarchy. By the time he returned to England in 1533, he was 14 years old and considerably more politically prepared than most English nobles of the same age. His childhood had been highly unusual. He had been separated from his mother, raised in an independent household, educated by important humanist scholars, trained in aristocratic military culture, given some of the highest titles in England associated with regional government, considered for a foreign crown, and then sent to live among the French royal family. All of this had happened before he reached 15. The problem remained that no amount of education could erase the legal circumstances of his birth. While FitzRoy was in France, Henry VIII's marriage crisis reached its decisive stage. Henry secretly married Anne Boleyn in early 1533. Thomas Cranmer, the newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, subsequently declared Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid. Anne was recognized as queen, and England moved further away from papal authority. In September 1533, Anne gave birth. Henry expected a boy. The child was instead a girl, Elizabeth. Elizabeth was healthy, and Henry immediately recognized her as his legitimate heir, but the fundamental dynastic problem remained. Once again, the king had a daughter when he wanted a son. For FitzRoy, this meant that the birth of Elizabeth had not removed him from political relevance. His position now became even more complicated. Princess Mary remained alive but was being pushed away from the succession because Henry no longer recognized his marriage to Catherine as valid. Elizabeth was the new legitimate royal daughter. FitzRoy remained the king's only acknowledged male child. Anne Boleyn therefore had good reason to take his position seriously. Rather than openly attacking FitzRoy, Anne supported a political arrangement that connected him directly to her own extended family. On November 28, 1533, Henry FitzRoy married Lady Mary Howard. Mary was the daughter of Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, one of the most powerful nobles in England. The Howards were also connected to Anne Boleyn. Anne's mother, Elizabeth Howard, was the Duke of Norfolk's sister, making Anne and Mary Howard members of the same extended family network. The marriage therefore brought FitzRoy into the Howard political orbit. For Anne Boleyn, the arrangement had clear advantages. If FitzRoy became closely connected to her family, he became less useful to factions attempting to remove her or challenge her daughter, Elizabeth. Instead of allowing the king's illegitimate son to become an independent focus for opposition, the marriage tied him to people whose fortunes were connected with the new queen. For the Duke of Norfolk, the calculation was equally attractive. If Anne eventually produced a legitimate son, Norfolk would remain closely connected to the royal family through his niece. But if Anne failed and FitzRoy eventually became Henry's chosen successor, Norfolk's own daughter would be FitzRoy's wife. Mary Howard could become queen. Norfolk was therefore positioned to benefit from more than one possible outcome. The marriage also demonstrated that powerful aristocrats were willing to treat FitzRoy as a figure with a potentially extraordinary future. The Duke of Norfolk would not have attached his daughter to FitzRoy if the young man had been politically irrelevant. However, Henry VIII imposed an unusual restriction on the marriage. FitzRoy and Mary were both about 14 years old. The king ordered them to live apart instead of as a traditional husband and wife. He delayed the full completion of their marriage because he believed that taking on adult marital duties at such a young age could harm his son's health and physical development. The decision meant that the marriage existed legally and politically, but FitzRoy and Mary did not establish a conventional married household. At the time, this probably appeared temporary. There was no obvious reason to believe they would not begin married life normally when FitzRoy was older. But the restriction would later become extremely important. The absence of consummation would give Henry VIII a technical argument for denying Mary Howard some of the property and financial rights normally expected by a duke's widow. More importantly, it meant FitzRoy produced no child during the marriage. By the end of 1533, Henry FitzRoy had entered a new stage of his life. He was no longer the small boy whose titles could be dismissed as symbolic honors controlled by adult counselors. He had returned from the French court with international experience, entered one of England's most powerful aristocratic families through marriage, and remained the only acknowledged son of Henry VIII. At the same time, the king's legitimate family was becoming more unstable rather than less. Catherine of Aragon had been removed from the position of queen. Princess Mary's status was under attack. Anne Boleyn had produced Elizabeth, but not the son Henry expected. England was moving into open conflict with Rome. Every change in Henry VIII's marital policy altered FitzRoy's position. For the moment, he remained outside the official line of succession, but he was now close enough to the throne that every failure in the king's legitimate marriages made the question more difficult to ignore. By 1535, with both of Henry's daughters facing legal exclusion, FitzRoy's status as the sole acknowledged male heir became a formidable political reality. FitzRoy, meanwhile, was approaching adulthood, had been trained for government, and remained the king's only acknowledged male child. The legal framework surrounding the succession was also changing rapidly. Henry VIII's break with Rome was no longer simply a dispute about his marriage. The English crown was steadily assuming powers that had previously belonged to the papacy. Parliament passed legislation recognizing Henry as supreme head of the Church of England, while those who refused to accept the new royal supremacy faced increasingly severe consequences. The succession therefore became connected not only to bloodline and legitimacy, but also to obedience to the king's new religious and political settlement. FitzRoy occupied an unusual place inside this transformation. He had no need to challenge Henry's religious policies. His entire status depended on his father. Unlike Princess Mary, whose legitimacy was inseparable from Catherine of Aragon's marriage, and therefore from papal authority, FitzRoy's political future depended almost entirely on Henry VIII's personal will. If Parliament gave the king greater control over the succession, FitzRoy's chances could improve dramatically. At the same time, his marriage to Mary Howard kept him closely tied to one of the most powerful aristocratic families in England. The Howard connection was useful, but it also made FitzRoy part of the increasingly unstable politics surrounding Anne Boleyn. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, was Anne's uncle, yet the relationship between the Queen and her powerful relatives was never simple. The Howard family's interests extended far beyond Anne's personal survival. If Anne remained queen and produced a son, they would benefit. If Anne fell and FitzRoy rose, Mary Howard's marriage to the king's son offered another route toward power. For Henry VIII, this made FitzRoy valuable but potentially dangerous. He had deliberately created a powerful royal son, but by doing so, he had also created someone around whom political factions might gather. The stronger FitzRoy became, the more carefully the king had to control his household, marriage, alliances, and public role. The situation changed sharply in January 1536 when Catherine of Aragon died. Her death removed one of the central obstacles from Henry's domestic politics, but it did not solve the succession problem. Princess Mary remained alive and continued to attract sympathy from those who believed her legitimate. Anne Boleyn, meanwhile, was under intense pressure to produce a male heir. Soon after Catherine's death, Anne suffered a miscarriage. According to reports circulating at court, the lost child was male. For Henry VIII, this was especially damaging. Anne had already given birth to Elizabeth in 1533, and subsequent pregnancies had failed to produce the healthy son he wanted. The miscarriage weakened her position at exactly the moment when Henry's patience was disappearing. FitzRoy's importance increased automatically. If Anne could not provide a son, Henry would once again face the same problem that had haunted his marriage to Catherine. But the political circumstances were now different. He had already broken with Rome, altered the status of his daughters, and demonstrated that Parliament could be used to redefine the rules governing legitimacy and inheritance. The crown was no longer operating under the same constraints that had existed a decade earlier. Anne Boleyn's downfall followed quickly. During the spring of 1536, accusations of adultery, incest, and treason were brought against her and several men at court. Whether the charges reflected actual conduct or were constructed as part of a political campaign, the result was decisive. The Queen was arrested and sent to the Tower of London. FitzRoy was drawn directly into the events. In May 1536, when he was 17 years old, historical accounts indicate FitzRoy was dispatched to witness Anne Boleyn's execution as a royal representative. FitzRoy stood at the Tower as the Queen was beheaded by a specially brought French swordsman. For a young man raised close to the monarchy, the event carried an unmistakable lesson. Royal status offered extraordinary privilege, but proximity to the crown could also become fatal when the king's confidence disappeared. The execution also removed a major political obstacle from FitzRoy's path. Anne had been the mother of Princess Elizabeth and the central figure behind the marriage settlement that connected FitzRoy to the Howard family. With Anne dead, Elizabeth's status became vulnerable. Parliament soon passed the Second Succession Act. The law transformed the political landscape. Both Mary and Elizabeth were declared illegitimate. Henry VIII had now legally excluded both of his daughters from the normal succession. More importantly, Parliament granted the king the authority to determine the succession through letters patent or his last will. This gave Henry a degree of personal control over inheritance that earlier English kings had not possessed in the same form. For FitzRoy, the implications were enormous. The central obstacle to his becoming heir had always been his illegitimacy. But after the Second Succession Act, Mary and Elizabeth were also legally illegitimate. The distinction that had previously favored the princesses had been dramatically weakened. Henry VIII could now decide which of his children, or potentially which other relative, would inherit. FitzRoy was the only acknowledged son of the king. He was also no longer a child. At 17, he had years of elite education behind him, experience at the French court, major noble titles, vast estates, and a political marriage connecting him to the Howards. His offices associated him with military and regional government. He had already been treated publicly as a figure of exceptional rank for more than a decade. Foreign diplomats immediately understood the significance. Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, closely monitored the Tudor succession to support Princess Mary. At the time, foreign observers suspected King Henry was preparing to name FitzRoy as his heir. Political leaders agreed that if Mary and Elizabeth were excluded from the line of succession, FitzRoy's royal blood and position as the king's son made him the most logical alternative for the throne. The question was no longer whether Henry FitzRoy was important. The question was whether Henry VIII would use his new legal authority to place him directly in the succession. There were practical reasons for doing so. FitzRoy was male, which answered the political preference that had driven much of Henry's marital crisis. He was already known to the nobility. He had been trained for authority. His connection to the Howard family gave him access to one of England's most powerful aristocratic networks. His years in the North provided him with an identity connected to military government, while his experience in France gave him international credibility. Compared with the uncertainty surrounding Mary and Elizabeth, FitzRoy offers an obvious advantage. He could potentially assume adult political responsibilities much sooner. If Henry died unexpectedly, England would not have to wait years for FitzRoy to reach maturity. By the late 1530s, he would be a young adult with his own household, estates, advisors, and military connections. This was precisely the kind of political stability Henry VIII had spent much of his reign trying to secure. However, recognizing FitzRoy as heir would still have been controversial. Illegitimacy remained a powerful legal and social stigma. Henry could alter statutes, but that did not mean every nobleman or foreign government would automatically accept an illegitimate king. Princess Mary still had supporters inside and outside England, and the Habsburg dynasty could use her claim as a justification for political intervention. Elizabeth, although a child, also had supporters connected to the religious changes of the 1530s. Naming FitzRoy could therefore solve one succession problem while creating another. Henry VIII had to consider not only who possessed the strongest blood claim, but also who could actually hold the kingdom together. During the summer of 1536, these possibilities appeared unusually immediate. Anne Boleyn was dead. Mary and Elizabeth had been legally removed from the direct line. Henry had married Jane Seymour, but she had not yet produced a child. Until another legitimate son was born, FitzRoy remained the only living male descendant Henry VIII had publicly acknowledged. At this exact moment, however, FitzRoy's health began to deteriorate. The change appears to have been rapid. In early July, he developed a severe fever. He lost weight and suffered from a persistent, violent cough. Physicians were called, but 16th century medicine had little ability to identify or treat serious respiratory disease. While contemporary records described his illness as consumption, many modern historians note that his rapid 3-week decline suggests an acute respiratory infection or even pneumonic plague, rather than standard tuberculosis. The symptoms were alarming because consumption could progress slowly over years or destroy a weakened patient with frightening speed. FitzRoy was only 17, but youth offered no reliable protection against infectious disease. Tudor royal households could provide expensive food, physicians, medicines, and comfortable rooms, yet they had almost no effective defense against many bacterial infections. Rumors began circulating almost immediately. Because FitzRoy's illness came shortly after Anne Boleyn's execution, some people suspected poisoning. The political atmosphere made such accusations easy to believe. The Boleyn faction had recently been destroyed, several men had been executed, and enormous interests surrounded the succession. But there is no strong evidence that FitzRoy was poisoned. The recorded symptoms are more consistent with severe respiratory illness, possibly tuberculosis or another aggressive pulmonary infection. What made the illness politically devastating was its timing. Only weeks earlier, FitzRoy's path to the throne appeared completely unobstructed. The profound legal barriers that had historically blocked an illegitimate son were entirely dismantled, leaving him as the undisputed center of gravity within the Tudor dynasty. The immense political machinery required to formally crown him was already moving into position. Then, the young man who had been heavily armored against every conceivable danger of princely life encountered the one threat Tudor legislation could not dictate: disease. There was no statute Henry VIII could pass to reverse it. No title, estate, foreign alliance, or military office could protect FitzRoy's lungs. The expensive education that had prepared him for government became irrelevant once his health collapsed. His condition worsened during July. The cough became more severe. His weight continued to fall. The fever did not break. Those around him would have understood that recovery was becoming increasingly unlikely. Consumption carried a frightening reputation precisely because physicians possessed few effective treatments beyond rest, changes in diet, bleeding, purging, or other methods that often did little to stop the underlying disease. For Henry VIII, the situation was extraordinary. The king had spent years treating his son as both a political asset and a possible solution to the Tudor succession. FitzRoy had been removed from his mother, placed inside a royal household, educated by leading scholars, trained in warfare, elevated above the nobility, assigned vast resources, sent to France, and married into the Howard family. Every stage of his life had been deliberately managed. Now none of that management mattered. On the night of July 22, continuing into the early hours of July 23, 1536, Henry FitzRoy died at St. James's Palace. He was 17 years old. His death created an immediate political problem. The king had lost his only acknowledged son at precisely the moment when the legal succession was unusually unstable. Jane Seymour had not yet produced an heir. Mary and Elizabeth remained illegitimate under the new law. FitzRoy, who might have served as the male alternative, was suddenly gone. Yet Henry did not respond with the kind of grand public funeral that FitzRoy's rank might have suggested. The opposite happened. The king ordered that the death and burial be handled with extreme secrecy. Fear of disease may have contributed to the decision, But dynastic politics mattered as well. Public attention to the death of the king's only son could emphasize the fragility of the Tudor succession at the worst possible moment. The same young man who had once been displayed before nobles and ambassadors as Duke of Richmond and Somerset was now to disappear from London almost without ceremony. FitzRoy's body was placed inside a heavy lead coffin. Instead of a great royal procession, the coffin was transported discreetly under the supervision of the Duke of Norfolk. It was loaded onto a rough cart and concealed beneath straw, creating the appearance of an ordinary agricultural load rather than the funeral transport of one of the highest-ranking men in England. Only a tiny number of attendants accompanied him. The destination was Thetford Priory, the traditional burial place of the Howard family. The contrast was severe. FitzRoy had spent his childhood surrounded by hundreds of servants and had been raised in public ceremonies designed to announce his importance. Yet his final journey out of London was quiet, concealed, and deliberately stripped of royal display. Even in death, however, his story was not finished. The young duke's burial would later be disturbed by another of Henry VIII's major political transformations, while the consequences of FitzRoy's death would reshape the succession that his father had spent decades trying to control. Henry FitzRoy's death in July 1536 did more than remove one young nobleman from the Tudor political system. It eliminated the only acknowledged son Henry VIII possessed at a moment when the legal succession had been deliberately destabilized. Mary and Elizabeth had both been declared illegitimate. Jane Seymour had not yet given birth, and Parliament had recently granted Henry unusually broad power to determine who would follow him. FitzRoy had therefore died at the precise point when his potential value to the dynasty was at its highest. The circumstances of his burial reflected how uncomfortable the situation was for the crown. Rather than granting the Duke of Richmond and Somerset a public funeral appropriate to his rank, Henry ordered the body removed from London quietly. FitzRoy had spent much of his childhood being presented as a visible extension of royal authority, yet his death was handled almost as something that needed to disappear. His lead coffin was placed on a cart and covered with straw. With only a very small escort, it was taken away from London toward Thetford Priory, the burial place associated with the Howard family. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, supervised the arrangements. The same Howard family that had gained politically from FitzRoy's marriage to Mary Howard now became responsible for burying him. This was an extraordinary end for a young man who had been made Lord High Admiral, Duke of Richmond and Somerset, Lord President of the Council of the North, and one of the richest nobles in England. His funeral did not resemble the public ceremonies used to announce his advancement in 1525. There was no comparable display of dynastic symbolism. Instead, the crown prioritized discretion. The burial at Thetford was not even permanent. 3 years later, Henry VIII's religious policies reached Thetford Priory itself. The dissolution of the monasteries was dismantling religious houses across England, transferring their wealth and property to the crown. Thetford was scheduled for suppression in 1539. For Thomas Howard, this created a deeply personal problem. The priory was not simply another monastery. It contained the graves of his family, including that of Henry FitzRoy. Norfolk appealed to the king to preserve the church. The argument was especially significant because FitzRoy was Henry's own son. If any family connection might persuade the king to spare the building, the burial of his only acknowledged male child seemed a strong reason. Henry refused. The decision reveals the extent to which political objectives could override personal commemoration. FitzRoy had once been an important component of Henry's dynastic strategy, but the king was not willing to interrupt the broader dissolution program in order to protect his son's original tomb. Norfolk, therefore, had to remove FitzRoy's coffin. For the second time after his death, the body was transported to another location. The lead coffin was eventually placed at St. Michael's Church in Framlingham, where the Howard family maintained another important burial site. The delayed consummation of FitzRoy's marriage, originally framed as a protective measure for a teenage boy, immediately transformed into a calculated financial weapon upon his death. Henry VIII exploited this strict legal technicality to strip Mary Howard of the vast dowager properties and financial guarantees normally granted to a duke's widow. Instead of enriching the powerful Howard faction, FitzRoy's massive accumulation of estates, regional administrative headquarters, and sheer liquid wealth was seamlessly absorbed back into the crown's treasury. Mary, who had theoretically stood one step away from the throne, was reduced to a teenage widow fighting for a delayed pension, definitively proving that FitzRoy's value to his father ended the moment he stopped breathing. FitzRoy left no children. That detail was politically important. Had he produced a son, Henry VIII would still have possessed a male line descending directly from himself, even after FitzRoy's death. Because there was no child, the entire FitzRoy possibility ended in July 1536. Henry VIII was again without any living son. The consequences became particularly important because Jane Seymour did not become pregnant immediately after marrying Henry. For more than a year after FitzRoy's death, the king remained in the position he had spent much of his reign attempting to escape. His daughters existed, but had been legally excluded from the normal succession, while the male child he had spent years preparing for political responsibility was dead. Only in October 1537 did Jane Seymour finally give birth to Prince Edward. Edward's birth fundamentally changed the problem. For the first time since the infant Prince Henry had died in 1511, Henry VIII possessed a legitimate surviving son. Edward immediately occupied the position FitzRoy could never automatically claim. He was a legitimate Prince of Wales and the undisputed male heir. The arrival of Edward makes it easy, in retrospect, to treat FitzRoy as irrelevant to the succession because a legitimate son eventually appeared. That interpretation overlooks the timing. When FitzRoy died, Edward did not exist. No one in July 1536 could know that Jane Seymour would successfully deliver a boy the following year. Nor could anyone know that Edward would survive childhood long enough to become king. Tudor children, including royal children, frequently died young. Henry VIII himself had already experienced this reality repeatedly. FitzRoy's importance must therefore be judged according to the circumstances of 1536, not by knowledge of what happened afterward. At 17, he occupied a position that no other illegitimate child of Henry VIII approached. The king had not merely acknowledged him. He had constructed an institutional framework around him from childhood. Every stage of his existence had been meticulously engineered for power. The child who was extracted from a quiet priory was placed in command of an independent household of hundreds. Exhaustive training by elite humanist scholars in languages, classical literature, law, theology, and court behavior had prepared a prince in all but name. The rigorous instruction in hunting, archery, horsemanship, and martial culture had forged an elite Tudor commander. He had been elevated to the Order of the Garter at the unprecedented age of 6. He had received the deliberate bestowal of the Richmond and Somerset titles, names deliberately connected to Henry VII and the Tudor family's dynastic origins. He commanded immense revenues. He was associated with government in northern England, held major military titles, was appointed Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, and was even discussed as a possible King of Ireland. Later, he lived at the French royal court alongside princes who would become important European rulers. These steps did not prove that Henry VIII had definitely decided to make FitzRoy King of England. That distinction is important. There is no surviving document in which Henry explicitly states that FitzRoy had been formally selected as his successor. The evidence instead shows a long pattern of preparing the boy for unusually high authority while keeping several political options open. That ambiguity may have been intentional. Henry VIII rarely needed to make a final decision until circumstances forced him to do so. As long as FitzRoy remained alive, the king possessed an alternative. If Catherine of Aragon had produced another son, FitzRoy could remain a wealthy royal duke. If Anne Boleyn produced a legitimate boy, the same was true. If a legitimate heir never appeared, however, FitzRoy could potentially be moved closer to the throne. The Second Succession Act of 1536 made that possibility especially serious because it gave Henry the authority to determine his successor. Once Mary and Elizabeth had both been declared illegitimate, FitzRoy's own illegitimacy became less uniquely disqualifying. He was not suddenly legitimate, but the legal field around him had changed dramatically. Had he survived, Henry could have used Parliament or his will to strengthen FitzRoy's claim. Whether the English political elite would have accepted him unanimously is another question. Princess Mary retained significant support both domestically and abroad. Her connection to Emperor Charles V gave her claim an international dimension. Many English conservatives continued to regard Catherine of Aragon as Henry's lawful wife and Mary as his legitimate daughter. Elizabeth represented another potential faction, especially among people who accepted Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn and supported the religious changes associated with the break from Rome. FitzRoy, therefore, would not necessarily have inherited peacefully. His advantage was that he was male, adult, or nearly adult, wealthy, politically experienced for his age, and connected to important aristocratic networks. In a period when many political leaders feared minority government and female succession, these qualities could have attracted substantial support. Had FitzRoy survived, he would have profoundly altered the turbulent reigns of his half-siblings. As an adult Tudor male with military backing, he could have stabilized Edward's minority, or sparked the exact type of civil war his father had spent a lifetime trying to prevent. Such a scenario cannot be treated as something that certainly would have happened. Tudor succession law was contested, and political acceptance could never be guaranteed merely by Henry VIII's wishes. But FitzRoy had been positioned more carefully than an ordinary royal bastard. That is what makes his death significant. The question is not simply whether Henry VIII definitely intended to crown him. The more important point is that FitzRoy provided the king with an option. His existence gave Henry flexibility during years in which legitimate sons repeatedly failed to survive. When FitzRoy died, that option vanished permanently. The king could still marry again, which he did. He could continue rewriting succession law. He could restore Mary and Elizabeth to the line of inheritance without formally declaring them legitimate, which eventually occurred. But there was no longer a living adult male alternative descended directly from Henry. FitzRoy's death therefore contributed to one of the great ironies of Henry VIII's reign. Henry spent decades trying to prevent England from depending on a female succession. His marriage to Catherine collapsed largely around the failure to produce a living son. His relationship with Anne Boleyn became tied to the expectation that she would produce the male heir Catherine had not. FitzRoy himself was elevated, partly because he represented living proof that Henry could father a son. Yet the Tudor dynasty ultimately passed through exactly the daughters whose position Henry had repeatedly destabilized. Edward VI succeeded Henry in 1547, but died only 6 years later. After the failure of the Lady Jane Grey succession, Mary became queen. When Mary died without children in 1558, Elizabeth succeeded her. The reign of Elizabeth I eventually became one of the defining periods of Tudor history. None of this means FitzRoy's survival would certainly have prevented Mary or Elizabeth from ruling. It does mean their path to the throne would have been far more complicated if Henry VIII's adult son had remained alive. FitzRoy's personal story is therefore inseparable from the larger Tudor succession crisis. His rise was not an accidental collection of honors given by an affectionate father. It reflected a monarchy searching continuously for ways to protect itself from uncertainty. His birth proved something Henry desperately wanted confirmed. The king could father a healthy male child. His childhood showed how quickly illegitimate blood could be converted into political authority when the monarch chose to support it. His titles demonstrated Henry's willingness to associate him publicly with the Tudor dynasty. His education and foreign experience prepared him for responsibilities far beyond those normally expected of a royal bastard. His marriage linked him to one of the most powerful families in England, and the succession legislation of 1536 brought him closer than ever to a situation in which his illegitimacy might be overcome by royal authority. Then, at 17, he died. Centuries later, when the Howard burial vault at Framlingham was examined, FitzRoy's remains were found there. Beside him lay the remains of Mary Howard, the woman he had married as a teenager, but with whom he had never been permitted to establish a normal married life. There is a tendency to describe Henry FitzRoy simply as Henry VIII's illegitimate son. The description is accurate, but incomplete. He was also an experiment in Tudor dynastic politics. Henry VIII took a child who possessed royal blood without legal legitimacy and tested how far royal authority could elevate him. The answer was remarkably far. FitzRoy could not automatically become Prince of Wales, but he could become a double duke. He could command immense wealth. He could hold offices connected with the military, Ireland, and northern government. He could marry into the highest aristocracy. He could be educated beside European princes. He could become important enough that foreign diplomats watched his position carefully. What Henry VIII never had to decide was whether the final step would actually be taken. FitzRoy's death prevented that decision. For years, Henry had been building a possible solution to the Tudor succession without openly committing himself to it. In July 1536, disease removed that solution before the king was forced to reveal how far he was prepared to go. Henry FitzRoy therefore never became a king, never governed independently, and never produced a dynasty of his own. But for a short period he stood unusually close to the center of Tudor power. His life illustrates the limits of even Henry VIII's authority. The king could alter marriages, pressure Parliament, redistribute estates, create titles, challenge the papacy, and change the rules governing succession. What he could not control was the biological uncertainty that had created the succession crisis in the first place. The son he had spent years preparing as a political alternative died before that alternative could be tested. And with FitzRoy's death, the Tudor monarchy was forced back toward the daughters Henry VIII had spent so much of his reign trying to replace.